Hello, friends, and welcome to Conversations with Consequences. We are the radio show and podcast of the Catholic Association, where we aim to change the culture one conversation at a time. You can listen to Conversations with Consequences on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. We are also on Sirius XM Channel 130. Of course, our radio show is always a podcast. Go to thecatholicAssociation.org/podcasts or directly to wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm your hostess, Dr. Gracie Christie, and joining us next is an old friend of the show. Her name is Katy Faust. Welcome to the show, Katy.
It's always good to speak to you. I'm always so grateful that you're covering these topics that a lot of hosts really are turning a blind eye to in a lot of ways. So thanks for having me on again.
Oh, well, I hope our listeners remember your prior visits to us. If not, please look them up in our show, in our list of shows. These are important topics that Katy's an expert in. Her last book was called Them Before Us. She has a website called thembeforeus.com, and she's going to tell us what that means. But I want to tell our listeners why we thought it'd be great to have you on. You do have a book coming out in the next few weeks, and we're going to have you back on to talk about your next book, which is called Pro-Child Politics: Why Every Cultural, Economic, and National Issue is a Matter of Justice for Children. I'd say that's about as true as statements get, is the title of your book. But I wanted to have you on because there is a lot going on in the news right now about IVF, in vitro fertilization. You and I have had really productive conversations on this in the past, very illuminating, I think, and informative. And talking to you has helped me understand why IVF is an injustice to children. And I thought, what could be a better time than to have you back on? So there's a lot of talk in the news about IVF. Former President Trump has talked about how much he supports it and how he would like to have a federal law that would make it something that every insurance will cover, and it's something that's totally within the reach of every couple who is suffering from infertility. And I just think that's so problematic on so many levels. So, Katy, why don't we start unpacking the mystery of IVF, and with the caveat, I think that's very important. Many of our listeners, I don't know if most, or it's probably most, are Catholic, and many Catholics I have found, for no fault of their own, don't understand the social justice, the social injustice and human injustice of IVF. No fault of their own. If no one tells you something, how would you know? But I thought we could start from that end. Why would a Catholic have a greater grasp of this than someone maybe like President Trump, who seems to think that this is just hunky-dory?
Yeah, well, I am not Catholic. I'm married to a Baptist pastor turned Baptist chaplain. So I don't have the same kind of church authority in terms of the teaching around this that a lot of your Catholic listeners do, because your church is actually very clear on reproductive technologies like IVF and surrogacy in a way that a lot of Protestants are not. I come at this opposition to IVF, or this critique of IVF, opposition to third parties being used in reproduction, somebody else's sperm, somebody else's egg, somebody else's womb, from the perspective of child protection and child justice. So that's what Them Before Us is about. The idea is putting them, the children, before us, the adult, on all matters of marriage and family. And that makes us very fierce critics of what we call big fertility, which is the baby-making industry that creates children in laboratories, sometimes using the sperm and egg of their own biological parents that are going to take them home and raise them, very often not. And we are very critical of this industry because it attacks two primary child rights. The first one is their right to life, and the second one is their right to be known and loved by their mother and father. So when you look at it from the perspective of child protection, big fertility is an enemy of children, not a friend of children. Now, President Trump talked about his support for IVF, the desire to force insurance companies or the government to subsidize IVF for all couples that want it, because he says, well, we want more babies. And who disagrees with that? Not me. I actually understand that from a demographic perspective, we are in a baby crisis. We are not making enough babies. 70% of the world lives in countries that are not reproducing themselves, and that is disastrous. So we need more children, but not the artificially created means of making babies in a laboratory and then subjecting them to eugenics-like screening, determining, based on fitness or sex or even eye color sometimes. So we are critical of the baby making industry because it largely victimizes children. I don't think that is an accident when you look then at church teaching, Catholic church teaching around this topic. Obviously, the revelation of God in his word and the manifestations of victimization of children in the world are going to reinforce one another because both the Word of God and the world of God have the same author.
Katie, I knew when I asked you that you weren't Catholic. I know that about you. But I was getting at exactly that point, which I think for Catholics, there is some clarity around the idea that an embryo is already a human being with dignity that should not be violated through his or her elimination, right? Because that embryo didn't measure up, it's not healthy enough, or we already had 6, we don't need these extra 3, or we want to implant a girl, we don't want to implant a boy. So I think Catholics have that drilled into them in the last few decades. It's been drilled into them, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't. And I would venture to guess that President Trump probably doesn't have that drilled into him, the idea that to discard an embryo has the same magnitude as an offense on human dignity as discarding any human being later on in development. What do you think?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that when people, when I started this work, when I launched Them Before Us in 2018, there weren't a whole lot of public advocate voices on the marriage front or on the pro-life front that was talking about IVF. We were still battling against abortion as the primary threat. And obviously we still are when it comes to children's right to life. But now what we're seeing is a massive shift, a massive understanding that if we're going to defend children's right to life, we have to both critique the baby taking industry of abortion and the baby making industry of big fertility. Now, why is that? It is because the way that IVF is typically practiced is to encourage the patients to make many, many more embryos than they could ever possibly parent or even implant. And so it's routine to, over-harvest eggs from the woman's body, fertilize as many as possible. Let's say 15 of them are successfully fertilized. Then they will say, all right, let's look at the viability of this. Let's grade them, give them a grade, A, B, C, D. Let's discard the ones that don't make the grade, or let's donate them to research. The ones that are fit, that look like they would be the right specifications based on what we want. Let's say there's 10 of those left. We'll implant 2. We're going to freeze the other 8. Look, the first 2 were successful. Now, we're an overwhelmed, parents with twins, and now we've got 8 babies on ice. That's why we have right now somewhere around 1.5 million frozen embryos in storage in this country. Many of them have been functionally abandoned. The rest of them are likely never going to emerge from the freezer again and maybe donated to research, or the best case scenario would be donated to another couple as if they are, shoes or furniture that you're done with, that you need to move on to something else. And so it's been very clear now, if you listen to the major pro-life voices, Lila Rose, Kristen Hawkins, the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, Seth Gruber, all of us now recognize that if we are going to defend human dignity from the moment of conception, we have to be very highly critical of reproductive technologies and IVF specifically.
What would you say to somebody who said, well, what if somebody did the IVF process in such a way as to only create embryos which will then be implanted? First of all, that might not even be possible because whoever you hire to do your IVF process is going to say no, probably, because they're not in the business of failing. And number 2, or failing by their measurements, right? Not by ours.
Right.
And number 2, would that how would that still violate? Because I get these questions from Catholics who want to be very merciful, right, and very conscious of the great pain of infertility, and how this IVF seems to solve this horrible, crushing burden, that some couples carry around sometimes their whole lives. Yeah. So what would you say about that? Like, if you could do it without embryo destruction, would it still be unethical?
So I've now spoken to thousands and thousands of people about IVF at conferences, largely at conferences. I've spoken at the Christian Medical and Dental Association, for example, or the group the joint conference between the pro-life OBGYNs and the actually child-centric American College of Pediatricians, and then a variety of other Christian conferences about IVF and how IVF victimizes children and how it overwhelmingly, like by the numbers, it destroys more embryonic life every year than the abortion industry. That this is an anti-child technology. And so at this point, I've spoken to thousands and thousands of people. And so far I've met six couples who have done what you've said. Six couples who said, I did not destroy any embryos. We did not use anybody else's gametes. I did not freeze any embryos, because once the kids go in the freezer, they very often do not come out again. So to me, freezing is prohibited. If you're going to do this in a way that's even remotely child-centric, you can't freeze any of them. There's no guarantee that they reemerge. And so there's only been 6, and they have largely had to fight their fertility doctors to do this in a way that does not victimize any child's right to life or right to their mother and father. Because, like you said, the fertility clinic is very concerned about the numbers. There's not a lot that fertility clinics have to report, but their success rates is one of them. And so if you do have a parent that says, I don't want to discard embryo, I want to implant the ones that even seem to be imperfect or not as viable, or they don't make the grade, what you're really doing is you're playing with the fertility clinic's success rate. And that's not something that they want to play around with. So they will discourage you from doing this. Also, what you described is cost prohibitive. If you're only going to make the number of embryos that you intend to immediately implant, that means that you're going to have to fork over a lot more money every single time. It's a lot easier to create all at once 15 embryos rather than 2 at a time, and then another 2 later and another 2 later. So most couples simply can't afford this. You've got people going into debt anyway to fund their IVF processes. And it's an incredibly financially burdensome endeavor. So for the sake of the success rates and for the sake of cost efficiency, people are always encouraged to create many more embryos than they could ever possibly use. And that is why we're getting this commodification mindset of children and this surplus embryo problem that we're facing in this country. So is it possible to do it in a way that does not violate any child's right to life or right to their mother and father? It's possible. It's incredibly rare. And then on the topic is it moral to create these children in the laboratory anyway? I would say that you would need to appeal to something other than the hard and fast natural law rights to life, right to their mother and father. You would then have to appeal to bioethics. You would have to appeal to church teaching or revealed authority. And those are areas where I would say you need to go talk to your priest. You need to talk to your pastor. There are some Christian bioethicists who say we should not be producing children in laboratories. We need to be begetting children in the womb.
Well, that's definitely the Catholic position. It's in the Catechism, and that is something that unfortunately many Catholics haven't read or hasn't been explained to them, of how important it is for a child to be conceived by the love of his mother and his father in that union, which is blessed by God, the union of the marriage bed. And of course, those things sometimes are violated, right? In the case of rape, for instance, there's terrible situations where that's not followed against, and that's not due to the will of the parent. But to go ahead and create a child outside of that union on purpose is, I think, something that many Catholics understand how unethical that is, but I wish more did that. It's a transgression of the way we're meant to love each other as male and female.
Well, certainly, once you start to involve a technician in the process, the child is automatically put in a position where they are at risk. And, I've had a few kind of significant Twitter battles over the last week. And one of them was simply kind of my tweet that is now had 1 million views. I'm like, let me just tell you the IVF facts. And there's all kinds of stuff swirling around the internet right now related to IVF. And should we protect it? Should we subsidize it? Should we ban it? I'm just going to give you some IVF facts. Okay. There are 90,000 IVF babies that are born each year. That is a fraction of the lab created babies. 93 to 97% of the children created in the laboratory will never be born alive. They won't make it through that gauntlet of elimination processes that babies have to go through. The ones that are born alive, 30 to 60,000 of them are going to be separated from their mother or father through sperm or egg, quote unquote, donation. And so and all of those kids, you are separated from a child at the moment of conception. You're going to deal with a lot of the identity struggles. You're going to deal with the feelings of commodification that these kids, they're going to have dozens or hundreds of half siblings a lot of the time. They're going to be worried
Katy,
about
repeat that percentage again for me. How many children will be unrelated to either their mother or will be separated from their mother or their father simply by being in the IVF, created through IVF?
Yeah, we know that there are about 90,000 children that are born each year through IVF. Mm-hmm. We estimate that anywhere between 30 and 60,000 children are created through sperm and egg donation every year. So we are looking at a huge chunk of, if you're making a baby in a laboratory. So 1/3 to 2/3
of these babies, these children are, and let me say it, they're made to be orphans. They're created as orphans.
That's exactly right. That's right. They're motherless or fatherless from conception.
On purpose. On
purpose. That's exactly right. Intentional motherless and fatherlessness. And now, and so when President Trump talks about subsidizing IVF, sometimes we go, well, that's wonderful. We want people to have children. No, what you're doing is you're subsidizing the death and destruction and motherless and fatherlessness of children, because who's going to get IVF subsidized? Not just the sweet, infertile, heterosexual couple next door. It's going to be the single mother by choice. It's going to be the single man who needs these technologies to create a motherless baby. It is the same-sex couples, both men and women, who are going to be deliberately depriving children of their mother or father so they can have the family that aligns with their romantic attractions, not the child's natural rights. Well, Katy, we are talking about subsidizing a baby-making industry.
Let's drill down on that for a moment, because I think that when President Trump speaks and people amplify his ideas on IVF, I think what's in their head, there's like this romantic vision in their head that you just mentioned, right? It's a young couple who have been unsuccessful in getting pregnant for 10 years, beautifully married together, a man and a woman, and it's just not working, and they're going to resort to IVF as a last resort, and this is exactly who we want having children, and this is going to help us get those babies so that we don't get into this demographic winter, which is waiting up for all of us around the corner. But the reality is very different, right? And yep. IVF is being used by men who have no desire or to marry a woman and make her and have her be the mother of his children. That's being used by male couples who, again, are using technological means to achieve something which nature is not intended for them. Again, these are motherless babes. It's being used for women and men, women especially, who didn't take the time to marry or have children because they were taking care of their career, knowing that they could resort to IVF later, right? So they have allowed their fertile years to go by on purpose because they had something better to do or what seemed better to them, and now are turning to this kind of transhumanist way of forming a family. And even people who are, way too old to be thinking of children, right? Yep. The 65-year-old grandma who decides she'd like to give it another go. Like, my oldest son and his wife had a baby a few months ago, and I keep having this dream that I'm pregnant, and I remember how happy I was when I was pregnant and how excited my life was, and I was thinking, I'm the kind of person who could fall for something like IVF and say, I just want to have that beauty again because I loved it so much, right? But I'm 55. I'm not supposed to have children.
Well, and what we've got is this elevation of adult desire above the fundamental rights and needs of children, and that is what the reproductive technology world facilitates, right? You're a single guy. You don't need a woman. You can purchase a woman's egg. You can rent her womb. You can take the child home to a motherless house. You're a lesbian couple, and you can just get an egg donor off of a website, or you can do it a more conventional way if you like. I mean, there's quote unquote donors who will drive around to your house and inseminate you. I mean, it's just very gross. But you also have our laws that are facilitating this. So California last week, passed a law redefining infertility, right? So, and this has been recommended by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, right? This is the main sort of authority voice speaking for big fertility in the name of medical, but really for the sake of their bottom line, not for the sake of the people involved at all. But now we're redefining infertility, and it's no longer a couple that is engaging in unprotected intercourse for 12 months or so and then unable to achieve pregnancy or live birth. Now we're calling it social infertility, right? Mm-hmm. You're infertile if you're single. You're infertile if you're in a same-sex couple, because now you're not able to get the children you want, no matter how much unprotected sex that you have. So that we can subsidize your desire to acquire these children who will be motherless or fatherless, we are going to redefine the word infertility so that you can have what you want at the expense of the child. So this is actually very, very serious. The collaboration, the cooperation between big fertility and our legal institutions are turning children into biological orphans, into legal orphans, and they're doing it very often in the name of progress and equality.
Katy, connect for me, if you can. Connect this for me. People aren't having children, right? There's a demographic collapse going on in our country, just like in every other Western country. At the same time, children have become a right? Everyone has a right to a child. You just described in California, someone like me would be considered infertile, and the state of California would have to pay to have me revved up on hormones and have IVF so that I could do it again after menopause, right? They would say, oh, poor woman, she's infertile. No, I'm not infertile. I'm postmenopausal. That's normal. But so what's the connection between a society that has stopped having children and a society that sees children as a right that everyone else has to pay for X person to create this child?
Yeah, well, simply put, it's self-worship. I mean, you have to swap out. You have to be the highest item on the value list. You yourself, your desires, your longings, your wants, your wishes has to be preeminent. You are the most important thing, right? That is the thing that connects the dots between the people refusing to have children and the people that are demanding children. I mean, both of those things have to bow down before the God of self. Right. My desire to reject children if I don't want them, if it's an unplanned pregnancy situation, for example, or my desire to demand children if I am infertile and, want to go around the barriers that my body's erected, or if I'm single, or if I'm in a same-sex couple, right? I demand children because it's all about me. It's all about fulfilling my longings, my wishes, my wants, my identity. When the reality is we need to put them before us. We need to put children before adults on all of the, especially marriage and family issues, because when we get it wrong, it's always kids that pay the price. They pay the price with their life. They pay the price with their connection with their own mother and father. They pay the price in terms of their household stability. And long-term, that means that they pay the price with their long-term thriving. It is very hard for children to form a stable identity. It's very hard for children to grow up and form stable relationships. It's very hard for them to have physical, mental, emotional, or academic health if we're starving children of these fundamentals that they are made for in childhood. It is the ultimate us before them. What's going on, both in terms of the demographic winter you explained, but also this demanding, this saying, I have a right to children the way I want, how I want, with whom I want. Both of them, ultimately, my diagnostic is it's because we've elevated ourselves to the status of God.
And so, besides these issues that directly impact the children of that are created like this in a technological way, what about the larger picture as to what a society looks like when children are commodified? Like, how else is that turning? How else is that changing our mentality and damaging our culture?
Mm-hmm. I think that obviously we see it the most starkly in the world of baby making and baby taking, the abortion world and the IVF and the reproductive technology world. Both of them says these kids exist for me. Mm-hmm. And if they're unwanted, I can violate their right to life and force them out of existence through abortion. But if they are very wanted, I can violate many child's right to life, maybe some child's right to their mother and father, and force them into existence through IVF. Right? They exist for me. I don't exist for them. But on a broader scale, I actually think that we can see that in every cultural issue, every economic issue, every national issue. And that's what, the next book, Pro-Child Politics, is about. It's let's look at every major political issue that we are facing today and see how it is that we are forcing kids to sacrifice for us when it should be the exact opposite in all of these different areas, whether it's national security or immigration or energy or the environment. We need to be thinking, actually, kids pay the price when we get this wrong. And we are seeing them as just items to shoulder our ridiculous debt, right? Or manage the ideological burdens that we're foisting upon them because we want something. We, the adults, want something. And kids are too small and too innocent and too vulnerable to fight back or speak up on their own.
To me, it was very clear, and maybe you agree with this, Katy, that during the COVID pandemic response, children were made to pay for the safety of adults in ways that we are going to be grappling with for many decades, I believe.
So in the next book, Pro-Child Politics, I conscripted 19 subject matter experts to write about religious liberty and race and pornography and the economy, things that I didn't feel like I could write on. But I wrote the introduction. I wrote the family chapter too, but I wrote the introduction and I started out with COVID because that, I think, was the most tangible, stark, immediate way that we could see kids had to be burdened on behalf of adults. We forced kids to sacrifice critical aspects of their social, emotional, and academic diet to protect people that did not need necessarily to be protected in the ways that kids did. But we made them do it because kids don't lobby, they don't blog, they don't write books. They just have to deal with whatever it is that adults foist upon them. And especially when we look at COVID, some of those kids are never going to recover from what we did to them.
Well, Katy, time has raced by and we are all out of it. Your book, your website is called thembeforeus.com. Your new book coming up, and hopefully you'll make time to join us again in 2 or 3 weeks, is called Pro-Child Politics, Why Every Cultural, Economic, and National Issue is a Matter of Justice for Children. Thank you for spending time with us, unpacking this IVF conundrum, which is occupying so much ground right now.
Yeah, thank you for having me. If you're listening, come to thembeforeus.com, subscribe, support our work. There is so much to do on behalf of child defense, and we would love to have you be a part of it.
Welcome back to Conversations with Consequences. Joining me next is my friend and colleague at the Catholic Association, Maureen Ferguson. She wrote a great piece that was published in Newsweek called Parents, Here's How We Can Protect Kids from the Dangers of Smartphones. Thanks for joining me, Maureen.
Great to be chatting with you, Gracie.
You know, the more that one thinks about smartphones and the effect that they're having on society in general, but especially on young people, the way it's changed the culture of youth and young adults, the way it's changed their pattern of interactions, the way it's changed the level of activities, the kind of activities that they engage in, the more we shiver, no? We shudder when we look at those smartphones in their hands. Sometimes you go out to dinner. I go out to dinner with my husband and there'll be couples with young kids. Each of the kids, like maybe a young couple with 2 toddlers, each toddler is holding one of their parents' iPhones and they're playing with it. And it's almost like we handed over our children to a technology that is a revolutionary technology, culturally impactful technology, mind-bending technology, and we don't know what it means, but we gave our children to it. So
right, and it's completely rewiring their brains on so many different levels. And normally the trajectory in a large family is that parents lighten up as they get down to the last child, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I've now raised 4 children who are now out of the house. I have just one 13-year-old left. But for me, it's been the opposite. The longer I parent, the more resolved I am to be super intentional as a parent with my youngest.
Which is not the same as intense, right? Like it's not the same as intense parenting. It's intentional is different.
Intentional, right. But, normally the youngest, you're lightest on the youngest. You go easy on the youngest. But as time goes on, the evidence is just mounting about just how terribly, terribly harmful smartphones and social media are for our kids. So I feel like our youngest is probably going to have the least access to smartphones and social media of all of our kids. And
so what kind of damage concerns you specifically?
well, okay. So what prompted me to write this article was I spent 4 hours watching a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on smartphones and social media. And the Senate committee had all of the CEOs of the big tech companies. So Mark Zuckerberg from Meta was there, Twitter, X, Discord. I don't even know if our listeners know what Discord is. If you don't, look it up. It's a horrifying, very popular platform that a lot of kids are on, particularly boys. But so these big tech CEOs were there, and I don't think I've been an observer of public policy for about 20 years. I don't think I've ever seen a hearing where there was such bipartisan agreement. Every senator, from the most liberal of Democrats to the most conservative of Republicans, they were hammering these CEOs because of the universal agreement about how terribly damaging these platforms are for our kids. So I wrote this piece because the defense of all of the CEOs, well, we have parental controls.
Yeah,
First of all,
good luck making those work. I've tried.
Exactly. And they all have different parental controls. They frequently change their parental controls. Parents don't have the technology to be able to manage the parental controls. And
even parents who are even parents who are well educated, very engaged,
oh, absolutely.
Maybe have a spouse, right? So if you're an only a single parent, your time is half, right? Your parental right. involvement is half. Yeah, even in that situation, parental controls are beyond most people's capacity.
Right. So who has the time to manage it all? Plus, kids know ways around it, and they're always changing anyway. So my message in this article that I wrote is, parents, you're the ultimate parental control. And I quote from the hearing, Senator Amy Klobuchar was, and she's a progressive Democrat from Minnesota. She told a story about one mom who told her that she feels like with her kids on social media, she said it's like the kitchen sink is running, the sink is overflowing all over the floor, and the mom said she's out there with the mop, just continually mopping up from the fallout of her kids on social media. So this is what I wrote about in the article. Parents, put down the mop. You can turn off the faucet. We don't have to say yes to our kids. And the current Biden administration Surgeon General is saying exactly this. He's saying our kids' mental health is threatened. Our kids' physical health is threatened. We have got to keep them off these platforms. So he's saying keep them off. And what his recommendation is to get together with the other parents in your kids' group of friends, to agree together, to collaborate, create a conspiracy for the good for your children, to say no to social media together as parents, so that then your child is not the only one who's isolated or left out. So this collaboration with other parents, when your kids are young, start the younger the better, is the way to effectively manage this for our kids, so that our kids can develop social skills. They can develop an in-person social life, and we have to be really intentional as parents in helping them develop a social life, because a lot of the sort of neighborhood play that used to exist just doesn't anymore, largely true. Because kids are all inside on their phones.
Or in their intense sports programs, which
exactly
suck up all the rest of the energy in the room.
Yeah. So parents have to figure out ways to help kids develop their in-person social life, especially for their teenagers, investing in a ping pong table.
What do you say to a parent? And I've heard this said so many times, and I know you've heard it said. What do you say to a parent that says, well, my child won't have a social life if she doesn't have a phone or he doesn't have a phone?
I would say it's the opposite. I would say your kids are far more likely to develop a real in-person social life if they're not always stuck on social media, because it's displaced time. When you look at the number of hours per day the average kid spends on phones, that's, there's only 24 hours in a day. So that's time that they're not spending in person. And And again, parents can help their kids develop that time by, having a fire pit in your backyard, make your house the party house, help your kids find hiking trails, buy those fun, silly card games like Exploding Kittens or board games like Throw Burrito. Teenagers love this stuff. Buy them junk food, make them want to hang out at your house. That's the way to help them develop a real social life.
And you know what children aren't doing either? They're not reading.
Oh, once they have a phone, they immediately tune out from reading. Absolutely. If you want your child to be a reader, don't give them a smartphone.
What does it say about our future as a people, right? Like what's the schools, which are very often, not in Florida, because in Florida we have great schools, but little plug for Florida schools. Schools are, have our children for so many hours, and then the phones have the rest of their hours, and they're not necessarily becoming educated adults with a broad mind and a historical perspective, and right, like an idea that there are different ways of living, and what are the best ways to live. Like that's not happening on your phone. That's something you pick up from books.
Absolutely not. No, the smartphones are making us dumber in so many ways. And not to mention the dangers lurking. At this hearing that I was talking about, the hearing room was packed full of parents who had lost their children to all kinds of different things, to fentanyl-laced pills that they bought on TikTok, to cyber bullicide. We have all these new terms, sextortion. Parents have no idea how bad it is out there.
We just had this in our community. I live in a very small, very protected community, mostly married parents. Sort of a little gem in the in the big culture, right? And we just had a terrible case of a gymnastics coach who was sextortioning his little gym girls, and it was all phone based. Yeah. And it's just horrifying to think that that's happening under our noses.
It's becoming shockingly common. And what happens is, that sounded like there was somebody that they knew behind it, but
there was, but still, it was all very phone based. Like it wasn't something, because young people are, they're looking into their phones. That you never look over their shoulders because they want to kill you if you try to look at what they're doing, right? So that's like this whole hidden world that's sitting in their palm. In the palm of their hand. That's full of dangers. And
exactly right. And the way that this sextortion is happening frequently is people think that they're communicating with a peer. So somebody thinks they have a new girlfriend or they have a new boyfriend. They're tricked and manipulated by the adult into sending a compromising photo of themselves. And then the person takes that and essentially extorts them either for money or to get them to send more pictures. You wonder where all this child pornography comes from. This is one way child pornographers get it. They extort kids into sending more and more photos of themselves. And they trick them into compromising acts, sending videos. It's a terribly, terribly dark world. And if you're handing your child a smartphone, in many ways, it's like handing them a loaded gun. It's like there was one cybersecurity expert in this research I did. He said handing your kid a smartphone is like handing, say your 13-year-old, giving them a smartphone. It's like giving them the keys to a Mercedes and say, take off and go to Vegas, have fun. It's so much darker than I think parents even realize.
Well, you said a word that we need to come back to, is that's pornography. We have a terrible pornography epidemic in not just in this country, in the entire world, but it's fueled. It's out of control because of the internet. And I think, I don't remember the age exactly, but I think, boys start looking at pornography on their phones very early, like 8 or 9 years old. And
the average age is 8 or 9 years old. And we think of it as a problem.
Think about that. That's enough to make you faint when you think of your sweet, pure 8-year-old boy looking at images that literally,
it's rewiring a generation of kids' brains.
Yes, it's rewiring their brains.
And it's completely distorting their view of human sexuality and authentic love. And it's taking a beautiful thing and making it ugly and scary. You wonder why some people aren't dating. Either it's because they're too self-absorbed on their phones, or in the case of a lot of girls, they're petrified because girls also stumble across this stuff online.
Well, and they're trying, and the boys that they have available to to date are boys who very often have had their brains rewired by pornography. So their brains are dark and vulgar, and they don't have a proper appreciation of a woman, a girl, right? As a human being, as not a means to an end. And I don't think it's too much to say that some of the reason that there's this horrible transgender epidemic or gender dysphoria epidemic amongst teen girls and preteen girls is because of pornography. Because pornography has devalued and degraded the dating culture. There is no normal dating culture if you have also a culture of pornography. So girls turn away and they say, well, I can't be a woman. I don't want to be a woman if that means you become a victim, right? Or an object to be used.
And, one point that I make in this article is how important it is to educate your kids on these things, because eventually they need to have some buy-in. When they're younger, you can protect them, but as they get older, you have to persuade them. So doing things like watching The Social Dilemma, it's a documentary on Netflix. Again, it's called The Social Dilemma. That goes a long way towards helping kids to understand how the social media companies manipulate them. And, kids don't want to be a fool. They don't want to be taken advantage of. So helping them to understand how the social media companies, these brilliant, Silicon Valley geniuses, are trying to manipulate them.
And they create those algorithms they suck your mind in.
Right. The entire business model is designed to suck them in, keep them online, take them away from in-person interactions. So we really have to give our kids the confidence, to be cooler than their screen-dependent peers, and educating them on these things. The Wall Street Journal, I feel like every other week there's a new headline about the Wall Street Journal keeps creating these accounts on Instagram or TikTok, and they show how girls within about 7 days are approached online by men with, nude pictures, or within 7 days, girls are, it's not just approach, but anyway, Google this stuff on the Wall Street Journal website, because they've done an excellent job of exposing some of this stuff. So as your teens get older, when parents do decide to give their kids these powerful tools, which it's really not a phone, it's a supercomputer, in their pockets. And again, when they're younger, there are a lot of, so-called dumb phones now. There are a lot of alternative products that you can give to your kids when they're younger so that they can phone and text, but they don't have, the internet access to go down the rabbit holes. But when you do decide to give your child a smartphone as they get older, I think one thing to consider is preempt the entitled assumption that this is their device.
Yes.
We call it a family phone, and I think it's wise to have one family passcode for all of the devices.
Exactly,
so if you have an
right.
iPad, a family computer, and the iPhones, one family passcode. So it just preempts that entitled assumption in their head that this is my private device. In our family, we call it a freedom basket that's just in our kitchen. And we encourage people when they come into the house to leave their phones there. And certainly our older kids keep their phones plugged in overnight in the freedom basket. It's a handy charging station, but to just keep educating your kids on how we don't need to be slaves to our phone. We tease them that we're not cyborgs. We don't want them to be screenagers. You can leave your phone. It's okay. It doesn't need to be in your back pocket at all times.
Well, wonderful advice, Maureen. And to our listeners, you can read her fabulous article in Newsweek and it's called Parents, Here's How We Can Protect Kids from the Dangers of Smartphones, published February 15. Thank you, Maureen. And thanks for all the great ideas and the encouragement to believe that we can sort of go countercultural and protect our children, even when everything seems to be going in the other direction.
We can opt out, and it's actually easier parenting to opt out, keep the smartphone genie in the bottle. It's a lot easier to keep the genie in the bottle than to try to manage the fallout once it's out of the bottle.
Every morning, the Catholic Association reviews all the latest news and sends our subscribers a carefully curated collection of the most important news of the day. Items are specifically selected for a smart Catholic audience like you. Don't let the world take you by surprise. Subscribe to our daily media roundup at thecatholicassociation.org. And now, Father Roger Landry offers a short and inspiring homily for this Sunday's Gospel.
This is Father Roger Landry, and it's a privilege for me to be with you as we enter into the consequential conversation the risen Lord Jesus wants to have with each of us this Sunday, when we'll get a glimpse of the awe of those who witness Jesus' miracles and works live. Jesus, by this point in St. Mark's Gospel, had already made people's hearts burn with his preaching. They had seen him cast out demons, cure many who were sick, feed a multitude with a few pieces of bread and fish, walk on water, and even raise a young boy and a young girl from the dead. On the force of this reputation, several true friends brought a man who was deaf and mute to Jesus, begging Jesus to lay hands on him. They were not to be let down. The Lord put his finger into the man's ears, touched his tongue with spit, looked up to heaven's side, and cried out in Aramaic, "Be opened." And the man's capacity to hear and speak were healed. Amazement seized them all. Even though Jesus told them not to say anything about the miracle, they couldn't restrain themselves. They were astounded beyond measure and cried out, "He has done all things well." Let's pause there for a second. He has done all things well. This line of joyful amazement in front of Jesus should be our Christian motto. Jesus has indeed done all things well. In his preaching, miracles, especially in his salvific passion, death, and resurrection, each of us should cry out with the residents of the Decapolis that the Lord has indeed hit a home run on every swing. Everything he does flows from his divine wisdom. He really does know what is best for his people in terms of our eternal salvation, and he carries it out. And his work hasn't stopped. He continues to listen to us in prayer. He continues to grant miracles directly and through the intercession of the saints. He continues to nourish us in the sacraments. He continues to do so much good and do it amazingly well. There would be many people at Jesus' time who would disagree that Jesus was doing all things well. Many of the scribes and Pharisees thought Jesus was a blasphemer and would turn out to be a colossal failure, a criminal executed shamelessly in the electric chair of his day, a so-called king who died crowned not with gold but with thorns. Little did they know what would happen on Easter Sunday. Many of the zealots who were looking to evict the Romans, who had political ideas of who the Messiah would be, likewise thought he was a failure. Little could any of these groups fathom what the small band of fishermen, tax collectors, and other relative nobodies would do in Jesus' name throughout the globe. Today, too, many in our culture challenge whether the Lord in fact does everything well. They criticize his teachings and the church he founded is behind the times, not with it, in a modern irrelevancy. They, too, will be in for quite a surprise one day. But as our society is becoming less Christian, more of these false ideas have been invading the minds of believers too. And this is a much greater concern. If Jesus were to ask us whether we think he did all things well, how would we respond? In general, I think all of us would want to respond that, yes, Jesus, we do believe that you are the Lord and therefore wisely know what you're doing and you do everything well. After all, Jesus, if you make mistakes, you wouldn't be divine. But it's when we turn to specific issues that we see whether we, like the residents of the Decapolis, truly praise Jesus for doing some things well or all things well. We can consider a handful of test questions Jesus might ask us in our contemporary to determine if we really trust him as God to do everything perfectly for us in our salvation. Do you believe that I did all things well in reiterating for you the Ten Commandments? Or do you think I should have made some of them optional? Do you believe that I did everything well in establishing the sacrament of my body and blood as the source of our personal loving communion, stating that unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you? Do you believe that I did all things well in establishing the sacrament of confession on Easter Sunday night? And do you come to me in the way that I established so that I may forgive your sins? Do you believe that I did all things well in setting a high standard for discipleship, in calling you to imitate me and living the Beatitudes? Loving others as I have loved you, being merciful to others if I have been merciful to you 70 times 7 and more. To humble yourself, to wash others' feet, to deny yourself, pick up your cross every day and follow me along the path to Calvary. Do you believe that I knew what I was doing when I ordained only men to be my apostles and priests? Do you believe that I did well in making marriage the indissoluble union of one man and one woman, in calling you back to God's original plan for marriage in the beginning? Do you believe that I did all things well in establishing a heaven and a hell? Or do you think I would have been more loving if everyone were to get to heaven no matter what he or she chooses to do in life? Questions like these are important ones for us to ask, because sometimes we can begin to allow the devil to sow seeds of doubt as to whether Jesus knows what he's doing and does well. Similarly, when Jesus allows us or those we love to suffer, or when people in authority in the church make decisions with which we don't agree, or when we're called to holiness by him despite all our weaknesses, we can think he hasn't done all things well, but in fact he has. To believe in Christ means to trust his words and action, to believe in what he said and what he did. This isn't always easy, and Jesus never promised that it would be. We can recall from the gospel a couple weeks ago how hard it was for the 12 to believe in Jesus' words, that they needed to gnaw on his flesh and drink his blood. A full year before Jesus made sense of these words by taking bread and wine at the Last Supper, changing them into his body and blood, and giving them to his apostles to eat. When Jesus asked if they wanted to abandon him as a result of his teaching, St. Peter, with real faith, said, not that he understood everything, but Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe and know you are the Holy One of God. In other words, Peter said, Jesus, you have done everything well until now, and we trust that in this too, you're doing perfectly and precisely what we need. Jesus calls us to trust him in this same way. One area in which we need to trust Jesus is in the responsibility he has given us for the spread of the gospel. As he ascended into heaven, he gave us the great commission to go and proclaim the gospel to every creature, baptizing them in the name of the Trinity, teaching them to carry out everything he has taught us, and knowing that he would always be with us until the end of time. He trusted you and me enough that he put the salvation of others in our hands. Yet 20 centuries after he ascended into heaven, only 2.5 of 8 people on the planet are Christian, and only half of those are Catholic. So many people don't yet even know Christ and his saving power. St. Therese of the Child Jesus, when once asked why so many centuries after Christ there are still so many who haven't heard of him, replied with great simplicity that it was because of the laziness of Christians. Did Jesus in fact do well in ascending to heaven and is leaving us on earth to complete a saving work? Well, he did. But many of us have not yet done well ourselves in responding to Jesus' summons and cooperating with the gift of the Holy Spirit to spread the faith. Jesus calls us to follow him in striving to do our mission well. That's something now I've been tasked by the Church to help catalyze. On Thursday, the Vatican's Dicastery for Evangelization appointed me the new National Director of the Pontifical Mission Societies in the United States, which means as of January, I'll have the responsibility of strengthening Catholics in our country in our missionary identity, in our prayers for those in the missions, and in our concrete support. I'm honored that Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen did this job for 18 years and really built up the office, and I'm trying to build on his foundation. Just as Jesus went into the Decapolis to spread the faith among non-Jews, so we're called to bring Jesus, his teachings and his very presence to the ends of the earth, so that they too might find him in him, their good shepherd, their Savior, their Lord, who through his passion, death, and resurrection did all things well to make possible for them eternal life and love. So I'd love to request your prayers as I take up this new assignment for the Church, that ask you to join me in praying that all Catholics in our country will be renewed in apostolic zeal, so that we may assist the one who does all things well, reach those who need him just as much as we do. On the day of our baptism, Jesus, through a bishop, priest, or deacon, worked in your life and mine a miracle similar to what he did in the gospel. He didn't use spit, but through a sacred minister put a dry finger in our ears and then touched our tongue, as the minister said. May the Lord Jesus, who made the deaf to hear and the mute to speak, grant that you may soon receive his word with your ears and profess the faith with your lips to the praise and glory of God the Father. Jesus opened up our ears in faith to hear his word and our mouths to speak to him and about him. He worked this miracle so that we might listen to him, treasure his word, and be so transformed by it that we might thereby transform the world. That's the way the Church's mission works in every age. We have ears and mouths opened so that we might hear God and then speak to him and speak of him to others. As we prepare for Sunday Mass, we ask the Lord to renew in us the grace of our baptism, to hear, obey, and treasure the saving word he proclaims to us in the consequential conversation of the gospel, to pass it on with great courage and holy pride as a lifeline to the whole world. Jesus has done all things well, and he wants to continue doing things well through us. And his greatest ongoing work is what we do at the altar in his memory. As we prepare to encounter him at Mass this Sunday, may we imitate those in the Decapolis in not being able to restrain ourselves from speaking about all the good Jesus does so beautifully well. God bless you.
With that, I leave you, and thank you again for being our listeners, and we continue to pray for you always.